Welcome to Theories of Addictions. In week 3 this week, we will be looking at psychopathology, substance use disorders, and co-occurring disorders. And in just a minute, I will be talking about what I mean by co-occurring disorders. In this first lecture, remember there are 2 lectures each week. In this first lecture, we will be looking at substance use disorders and their co-occurring disorders, those disorders that occur along with them. In the past, there was a hierarchical relationship imposed on the connection between mental and emotional disorders and substance use disorders. In fact, we categorized those disorders as primary and secondary disorders. The primary disorder was the mental or emotional disorder, such as schizophrenia and related disorders, trauma disorders, the depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, personality disorders, and so on and so forth. And then the secondary disorder would be the substance use disorder. However, we no longer use that kind of hierarchical categorization because within the new Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, the DSM, the latest version being DSM-5, we've eliminated that hierarchical categorization, and instead we've adopted what we call co-occurring disorders, again, without placing them in any kind of hierarchical relationship whatsoever. So that when mental and emotional disorders and substance use disorders are experienced by an individual, we refer to them as having co-occurring disorders. Or a term that you will hear probably even more frequently is the term dual diagnosis. So that if an individual has a dual diagnosis, you know that they have a diagnosis of a mental and emotional disorder along with a diagnosis of a substance use disorder. So how do we treat them? Well, there's been a kind of growing preponderant trend to shift away from placing individuals with severe mental and emotional disorders and maybe along with substance use disorders. We've moved them away from placing them into the hospitals particularly through the period of the 1960s through the 1980s. There was a tendency to release those individuals from the hospitals into the general public. So releasing them into the community on the assumption that they would get help at an outpatient community mental health treatment center. However, there were problems with that model of not only moving them out of hospitals, but even shutting those hospitals down, so that individuals with severe mental and emotional disorders were often in the community. As I said, there were some problems with that because many individuals were not consistent in getting the help that they needed from the community mental health treatment centers. Many of them, because there was no follow-up, became homeless, whereas their home was the hospital. Now they're out on the streets sometimes or in substandard housing. And because sometimes it was very difficult to follow up on them, many of them didn't take their medications regularly or sometimes not even at all. And as a result, they may have become more symptomatic. And then on top of that, they were subjected to the street drugs, and the rate of substance use disorders along with, severe mental and emotional disorders increased. With the substance use disorder, individuals engaged sometimes in crime, or more often the victims of crime. So prisons then became one of the major treatment centers for those individuals with severe mental and emotional disorders, and especially for substance use disorder. So we saw that this resulted in a growing public health problem with those who have a severe mental illness often not getting the treatment that they needed, and an increase in those with substance use disorders, most of whom also did not get the treatment that they needed. So what we saw was a huge social health problem, public health problem. Let's shift gears a little bit and look at today. What is the incidence or the numbers or percentages of mental and emotional disorders and substance use disorders among individuals? And the data are, pretty staggering if we look at them. We know, for example, that among those with a substance use disorder, that about 41% also have a mental and emotional disorder. Or in other words, about 41% of the individuals have a dual diagnosis. And among those with a mental and emotional disorder, 19% of them have a substance use disorder. So we see that if the individual has a substance use disorder, a huge percentage have a mental and emotional disorder. A lower percentage of those with mental and emotional disorders also have a substance use disorder. Only, and this is a disheartening statistic, only about 7% of those with a dual diagnosis actually get treatment. So 93% of individuals with a severe mental and emotional disorder, along with a substance use disorder in the United States, do not get treated. For the years of 2012 to 2013, research was conducted to determine whether a particular substance use disorder co-occurred with another substance use disorder. So the question was, if an individual has a substance use disorder, is there a tendency for that individual to also have another substance use disorder? Another way to say that, if an individual is addicted to a particular substance, does that individual tend to have an addiction also to another substance? So let's look at some of those data too. If we look at alcoholism, alcoholics make up about 19% of the US population, but only 15% of an individual with an addiction to alcohol, about 15% have another substance use disorder. So there are many individuals who may be addicted to alcohol but not addicted to any other kind of a substance. However, when we look at other substances and individuals with substance use disorder, we see a totally different picture. So for example, while individuals who regularly use cannabis or marijuana make up about 2.5% of the population, but 64% of marijuana users also have an addiction to another substance. Okay? And with more serious drugs than marijuana, we see that the percentage with another substance use disorder is quite high. For example, with heroin, if you use heroin, then there's about a 77% chance that you are also addicted to another substance. Cocaine, even greater. If you use cocaine regularly, then there's an 86% chance that you will also be addicted to another substance. Hallucinogens, LSD, for example, an individual who regularly uses hallucinogens, 91% of them will have another substance use disorder. And those who use inhalants, 98% of those individuals will be addicted to another substance. So you see, as we get to the harder drugs, beyond alcohol and marijuana, that the picture is rather alarming. Although with marijuana use, the number is fairly large too. Also, if we look at the question of whether individuals with severe mental and emotional disorders also have a co-occurring substance use disorder. So are there mental and emotional diagnoses that are associated with a diagnosis of a substance use disorder? And we do see certain conditions do seem to have a higher incidence. One would be personality disorders. 8.7% of individuals with a personality disorder also have a substance use disorder. And we'll get to what is meant by a personality disorder in just a minute. But if we look at post-traumatic stress disorder, 8% of those individuals will also have a co-occurring substance use disorder. I do want to say a little bit about personality disorders, because within the DSM-5 and in terms of treatment, personality disorders are looked at a little differently than some of the other mental and emotional disorders. Personality disorders differ from those other mental and emotional disorders in the following ways. The symptoms with a personality disorder are pervasive over a long period of time. Typically, an individual with a personality disorder um, begins to have those symptoms in adolescence or in the early 20s, and then those persist over time. They also have some maladaptive symptoms. In particular, often an individual with a personality disorder has really poor interpersonal relationships. And among some of the personality disorders, the individuals with particular diagnoses may have very turbulent and conflictual relationships with other people. They also experience misperceptions. What we mean by a misperception is that an individual makes faulty inferences. What do I mean by an inference? An inference is a particular kind of cognition or a thought that has a very specific task. An inference attributes meaning to some kind of situation, event, or a state of affairs. Or you can think of an inference as an interpretation of something. They may have a particular interpretation about the self or others or life or the world, etc. And those perceptions can be faulty, which may contribute to really deleterious emotions and behaviors. The individual with a personality disorder may have poor impulse control. Impulsivity can be a problem because there are lots of conditions, mental and emotional issues that are related to impulsivity. Juvenile delinquency, crime, suicide often is an impulsive act. So, and individuals with impulsivity have a greater likelihood or a greater tendency to engage in substance use. Another one of the symptoms that we see of personality disorders is difficulty with emotional regulation. That means once they get very upset, that it's difficult for them to calm down, or they may be easily frustrated. So for example, many kinds of anger are what we call frustration-based anger. The individual has frustration intolerance, and then they get easily frustrated, and then that goes into anger, which can be problematical in more extreme forms. These personality disorders are then, there are a number of those disorders, and they're divided into what we call 3 different clusters. And each of the clusters has particular kinds of presentations. The individuals appear in different way to others. There is what we call cluster A, and there the symptoms are rather odd. The individual may have some very eccentric thoughts and act in odd or eccentric, engage in odd or eccentric behaviors. There can be the cluster B, which is what we call the dramatic cluster. where the individual may be overly emotional and unpredictable. And then cluster C is what we call the anxious and fearful kind of cluster disorders. Okay. So let's move on. If we look at alcohol disorder, we see that 60% of those individuals who are addicted to alcohol or have that kind of substance use disorder tend to have antisocial personality disorder. Well, that was in cluster B, antisocial personality disorder. And an individual with that tends to have very low empathy for others. They may become engaged in criminal acts, lying, cheating, stealing, and have no conscience sometimes about that. If we look at drug use disorders other than alcohol, we see that about 40% of them also have antisocial personality disorder. 50% have what we call schizotypal personality disorder. It's a cluster A personality disorder. And there, it's this individual will have odd perceptions and experiences, etc., may gravitate into odd, maybe conspiracy type thinking or UFO belief and all of those kinds of things. Now, people who are who don't have personality disorders believe and get involved in those kinds of things. So it's just more common in this particular cluster of personality disorders. And also we see drug use disorders at a very high rate. About 80% of individuals who have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which is in cluster B, 80% of those with borderline personality disorder have a drug use disorder, substance use disorder too. Borderline personality disorder is where the individual with that has a very kind of fluid sense of self, not a solid sense of self, may be easily angered. They may cling to people and be fearful that someone is going to abandon them. They become easily enraged and demanding. They may engage in parasuicidal behaviors like cutting or even actual suicide attempts, etc. So it's more of the dramatic cluster there. Some individuals with substance use disorder do seek treatment, and that's great. And they do seek treatment. Some do seek treatment to have substance use disorder with a co-occurring mental and emotional disorder. So, but the most common co-occurring disorders are mood disorders, depression, or bipolar. About 21% of individuals with depression and bipolar will have a substance use disorder. Those with anxiety disorders, about 16.5%, especially those with panic and social phobia. Social phobia is afraid of typically engaging socially with others, maybe be afraid to speak in public. It goes beyond shyness. Shyness is not a mental emotional disorder. But so we can see that some of these disorders are highly correlated with each other. And so we'll go into more detail on that in lecture 2. And a very, very important question comes up, and that is why does comorbidity occur? Why do certain disorders exist along with other disorders? So for example, why is there a high correlation between individuals with major depressive disorder and a substance use disorder? Or why Why the high correlation with post-traumatic stress disorder with a substance use disorder? So lots of interest in what causes this comorbidity. And there are numerous theories about why comorbidity occurs. In fact, your text covers 10 such models that, and I want you to, to know them. They're on table 4-6 in your text in the 4th chapter. So take a look at those and know those in detail. But let me just pull out a few of those so you can see what some of the theories are about the comorbidity. One is that those connections between those disorders is just by chance, right? And some things just happen that way by chance. Well, why would we see it then? Well, it's very interesting because the brain is a pattern recognizing organ. And it's very important for our survival that we recognize patterns. Sometimes, however, our brain will have us see patterns that are not actually there, or make connections or causal connections between two things where there is no causality between them. But the brain just sees a pattern there. We do this all the time, right? Pattern recognition is a part of intelligence. It is important to learning, but there's also a downside to it if it's overgeneralized or misapplied, and not always easy to determine that. Another kind of theory is that they co-occur, these disorders co-occur because of sampling error. Are we sampling just individuals who have come for treatment, rather than look at individuals who've come for treatment, but also look in the general population? Because if we just look at individuals who present for treatment, then our sample would be biased, and we would call that a material fallacy of bias sample. And so we have to be careful about that and really dig in to look at whether our sample is representative of the larger population too. Another kind of theory is what we would say that these disorders that co-occur are actually alternate forms of each other, so that there may be one underlying kind of risk factor, and that particular risk factor gives rise to these two expressions. So really there are, phenomenologically, they look quite different, but at base they are coming from the same root. Another possibility is what's called the 3 independent disorders. In fact, what we may see is that, that there may be 2 disorders, the 2 that are co-occurring, but actually they're related to a 3rd disorder, and that the 3rd disorder has 2 different presentations, okay? So there's really comorbidity among those 3. Or another one is what we call correlated liabilities. When there, do the comorbid conditions occur because they share the same risk factor? If they share the same risk factor, then they're going to be correlated with each other and look comorbid. And then the other one is causation theory. Causation theory is, does one disorder cause the other disorder? And we'll see this when we look at the 2nd lecture, when we go to assess comorbidity and treatment. Did one of the disorders kind of occur first, and the symptoms of that disorder actually give rise to the other disorder? So for example, hypothetically only, does an individual with an anxiety disorder have really painful kind of agitation, difficulty sleeping, maybe racing thoughts or something like that, and to calm down, the individual began to take medication or illegal drugs or whatever, and to kind of deal with those symptoms, so that the anxiety condition kind of gave the self-treatment for the anxiety condition may have given rise to the substance use disorder. So those are some of those hypotheses or models for comorbidity that I would like for you to know. But please take a look at all of them. So I want to thank you very much for being attentive today. And in lecture 2, we will consider the treatments for individuals who have a dual diagnosis. Thanks again.
I plan to use my degree ultimately just to help people. I'm here to find out specifically what demographic that is.
The professors really take the time to look at the courses and how they're going to prepare us to be counselors.
I'm just really excited to get to learn from these people that have so much experience in this field.
It's obvious that they have a passion for what they're doing, not just because they enjoy it, but because they know they're investing in someone else, and that's most important to me.
I ultimately chose CIU because of the community. I love the fact that I know that I will be with the same people for the next 3 years.
We have a time during our classes where we get to be in small groups, and that allows us to get to know each other and to support one another and to learn together. I feel like I'm right where I need to be, and I'm grateful to get to be a part of this program.